right. Well, I think the headline for today's political corner is Republicans imploding. And, that makes me happy, of course, but I've really been thinking about the fact that somehow when the Republicans are fighting, it gets very little attention. And when Democrats are fighting, it seems to get more. And I think that's not only the news coverage, but it's also our own reporting of events. So Democrats are always going like, oh, we got the moderates and the progressives and they're fighting, and why can't Democrats get on message and have, be in lockstep? The Republicans always pull that off. And it's just simply not true, right? I mean, it wasn't true when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and when it wasn't repealed, it was because some Republicans stepped up. But what's happening now, I think, is really interesting. And if you're just looking at the political game, it's certainly good for us. It's terrible for the country, but it's good for us. So you've got the Republican National Committee, censuring members who, in good conscience are being part of the January 6th investigation. And you have them calling January 6th legitimate public discourse. And then you actually finally have some people considered the sort of establishment wing who are saying, this is not legitimate public discourse. This was a violent insurrection. So you've got Mitch McConnell saying that. You've got Mike Pence saying, you know what, I couldn't have overturned the election. Trump was wrong. I mean, this is a huge change for at least the public face of the Republicans. And I think, when Democrats disagree, it's on substance. It's on, I'm more progressive than you. I think government should work this way and not that way. And, it's much more legitimate. This is like, oh my gosh, the base still believes this guy that the election was a fraud. And the establishment knows that's not true, but they're afraid of losing. So they've been staying on his team. But staying on his team means, like, calling January 6th legitimate political discourse. So I think that's the real news this week. I think you've got Trump still overwhelmingly popular with the Republican base, and that is just really adds this conundrum for them. But to have an ex-president bringing primary challengers to incumbents, this is just like unheard of. So anyway, I think that's the top line news this week. The other piece is still around redistricting and how that is turning out much better than we could have hoped for. It's still, winning the House is still a big lift for Democrats, but at least we're not starting so far behind. 40 states are done with, making their maps. There's still 10 who could really throw off this balance. It includes people who are states where things are being challenged in the courts, like Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas. So there's still some numbers we don't know, but it is looking better. So I'll throw it out to questions and thoughts. I'd love to hear whether you guys think the Republicans are imploding or it's just me.
Yeah, it's not a question, but one comment is it's possible that we may be witnessing kind of the high water tide of Trump's kind of takeover of the Republican Party. That it's pretty ahistorical that support for democracy is a partisan issue that only capital D Democrats care about. And so far, there have been very few Republicans that have actively stood up and said, preserving our democracy is more important than winning our seat, or, or a lot of states, a lot of Republicans have not kind of criticized state action that's undermining democracy. And I think the rifts that you're talking about may be a reflection of some polls that show that Republicans used to blindly support Trump over the Republican Party, and now that's flip-flop. So they're have higher allegiances to the Republican Party than they do to Trump. And that combined with investigations of Trump and other things, it may be that you're starting to see, not that the Republican Party as reflected in the organized GOP, but in terms of the party as reflected by its leadership is starting to slowly kind of disengage from Trump.
Yeah, it seems like there's more cracks in the wall. We'll have to see how that goes. I know those polls where things have flipped, party above Trump or Trump above party, but I don't know what people mean by allegiance to party. Like, what does that mean that they have more allegiance to the Republican Party? Does that mean the establishment wing, the Mitch McConnell end of things? Like, how do you even define the party? The RNC is calling, is still on the Trump end of things. It's weird for the party to be so divorced from the RNC. So I don't know, but they're in chaos. Lisa.
Janet, normally our focus has been on kind of the low propensity, sort of getting Democrats to the polls, essentially. Do you think that there are a set of Republicans who are kind of convincible that if there's a Trump candidates, that they'll be like, oh my God, I got to vote Democratic now? Like, I'm just curious what you think of the implications for Republican voters if Trump's kind of, whatever, the way he speaks, or if the dialogue is, sorry, you get what I'm saying.
Yes.
I'm hardly saying it, but hopefully you get it.
I know what you mean.
Are there any Republicans, do you think they're pick-offable?
I think a lot of them were already picked off and voted for Biden, right? So the sort of college educated, we know where the truth lies, Republicans, I think most of them have defected. The question is, are there more of them? Are there people who, if there isn't a really Trumpy candidate, just won't come out? The white working class, not college educated folks who really turned out for Trump, they may stay home if there's a more establishment candidate. I don't know. It's hard to know. What we do know is that in 2018 and 2020, we got huge turnout, and we need to turn our people out. There's big questions about suburban voters, particularly suburban white women who came over to Biden, who, went back to a candidate like Youngkin. What they'll do now, it's interesting, there's been all this like school committee stuff where people, think they can win the suburban vote by saying to suburban moms, you should have a voice in what your children are taught, right? That was the whole critical race baloney. But what we're also seeing now is there's some women, suburban women, forming groups saying, you know what, book banning is bullshit, and we're going to stand up against that, and don't describe suburban moms as all these people who want to protect their children from the truth. So I do think that side is coming out. So we'll see. We got 9 more months to get everybody out there.
And Lisa, it may well be that independents are an easier group to try to bring over than Republicans in general, because I think they're more likely to be appalled if there's a strong Trump or some Trump kind of lookalike candidate. But Trump did dramatically expand the base of people who were not voting before, who did vote. And as Janet said, those people may stay home if there isn't a Trump person. But I do think it's important to note that there's a really sizable percentage of Americans that are independents, and they're probably easier to convert.
Yeah.
Any final questions, reactions?